Bible is a really, really long book. Like if you've ever picked it up and opened it, like you start flipping through and you're like, there's page after page after page. And they're like not normal pages either. They're super thin. And anytime you're gonna read a book, even if it's not the Bible, you have to understand some things that go into the story. For example, like if you're gonna read a comic book, part of understanding the hero of the story is you need to know the backstory, you need to understand the context of the story. Or if you're watching a movie and you see a character like Elphaba, you need to know some of the origins, what goes behind making her her. The Bible is the same way. When you read the Bible, you need to know bits of the origin story. You need to know how the whole thing begins. And so when you get to Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, there's helpful context to have when you read a book like Genesis. And so the whole Bible begins with the Old Testament. We give it the name the Old Testament because it's older than the New. The Bible doesn't actually ever call it the Old Testament. Some people call it the Hebrew Scriptures. But the Bible begins with a book called Genesis, and it begins in chapter 1 with the very beginning of all of creation. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And it says the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." The whole thing begins that way. It's the origin story. In fact, Genesis 1 through about 12, in a sense, could be the origin story of all of the Bible. And so if you want to know what God is like, if you want to know the Bible, you need to look at these first chapters because it sets up some distinctions in the Bible. Now, it's also important to know when you read the Bible, it doesn't begin like a history book. It doesn't begin with saying, all right, this date, this time, this person. It doesn't begin like a science book either. It's not saying this happens this scientific way. It begins like it's telling a story in the beginning. And it does that because the Bible wants to do something very important. The Bible wants to teach us something different about who God is. And so when you read the Bible, you could compare it to all kinds of other stories. Most people in the ancient times had stories of where the earth came to be. They had their own lore, their own backstory, their own context in saying this is what the world was like. And so when you read the Bible and you read Genesis, you'll find that the Bible is telling a different version of the same kind of story, the same creation stories. And so you might read Genesis 1 and you're like, oh wow, this is fascinating. God created the heavens and the earth, and there's day 1 and day 2 and day 3. And you could be like thinking, all right, do I need to read this in a scientific way? And the reality is no, you need to read it in a way asking yourself, how is this different than other stories? Then you read Genesis 2. Genesis 2 is also a creation account, different than Genesis 1, which can be a little bit confusing. But again, it's telling the story to point out something different about what is God like. The fascinating thing, if you read other ancient creation stories around the same time, is you'll find they have common themes that the gods were angry. And human beings were made because they're being slaves to the gods. And there's fighting and violence and slavery and all these things. But then Genesis 1 and 2, if you read it and you ask yourself, what's different about this story? What you find is God created human beings in his own image. He created human beings to be in relationship with God. In fact, that could be a foundation for the whole origin story. The whole thing begins, God wants to be in relationship with you. And so then when the origin story continues and you have Genesis 3, what is it about? It's about the relationship breaks. Sin enters into the equation, and sin puts a fracture between humanity and God. And then it continues all the way to Genesis 12, and you begin to hear a story of God making a promise, a covenant with Abraham. What is it about? It's about relationship. God restoring that relationship and making a promise that nothing's going to get in the way between the relationship God wants to have with human beings that he created from the very beginning. And then the whole rest of the Bible follows that storyline. The entire thing, as you continue, when you read the history books like the Judges and the Chronicles, when you read the poetry like the Psalms, when you get to the New Testament and the storyline of Jesus in the early church, all of it then picks up on that, where we begin, that God created us to be in relationship with him.